It started as a celebration of the most recognizable voice in the world, until Morgan Freeman revealed his deepest fear about losing the very thing that defined him. Studio 6B hummed with reverence that Thursday evening. The Tonight Show's signature blue and gold lights cast their familiar warm glow as the Roots laid down a respectful groove. 300 audience members filled every seat, their anticipation electric yet hushed, the kind of atmosphere reserved for true legends. Jimmy Fallon, crisp in his charcoal suit, bounded onto the stage with that infectious enthusiasm, though tempered with the respect due to tonight's extraordinary guest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jimmy announced with genuine awe, "please welcome the legendary voice of God himself, the incomparable Morgan Freeman." The applause was thunderous yet reverent as Morgan emerged from backstage, and he was everything the audience expected and more. At 86, he moved with the dignified grace of a man who'd lived 1,000 lives through his characters. His perfectly tailored navy suit emphasized his distinguished bearing. His silver beard was impeccably groomed, and those eyes, those knowing, weathered eyes that had witnessed decades of Hollywood history, twinkled with wisdom and warmth. He waved to the adoring crowd with characteristic humility, his movements deliberate and measured. When he spoke his first words, a simple, "Hello, Jimmy," the entire studio fell into that familiar hush that always accompanied Morgan Freeman's voice. It was like hearing music, like being wrapped in velvet, like coming home. They settled into their chairs as the applause died down, and Jimmy launched into his usual enthusiastic opening, though his tone carried an extra layer of reverence for the man sitting across from him. "Morgan," Jimmy said, leaning forward with genuine admiration, "first of all, thank you for being here. I have to tell you, when you said hello just now, I think half the audience expected you to start explaining the meaning of life." Morgan's laugh was rich and warm, exactly what you'd expect. "Well, Jimmy, I'd be happy to, but I'm afraid we only have an hour, and that particular topic might take a bit longer." The audience chuckled appreciatively, hanging on every word. Jimmy beamed. "See? This is exactly what I'm talking about. Even your jokes sound profound." The conversation flowed beautifully through Morgan's latest documentary project, his incredible 7-decade career, and his thoughts on storytelling and the human condition. Every answer was delivered in that unmistakable voice, measured, thoughtful, carrying the weight of experience and the comfort of absolute certainty. "You know what, Morgan?" Jimmy said, reaching into his jacket with theatrical flair. "Since you have literally the most famous voice in the world, I thought we'd celebrate that tonight with something special. I'm calling it the Morgan Freeman Voice Challenge." The audience immediately perked up, excited at the prospect of hearing Morgan Freeman demonstrate his legendary vocal talents. Morgan raised an eyebrow with amused curiosity. "Oh, this sounds intriguing," Morgan said, his voice carrying that familiar hint of playful skepticism. "What exactly does this challenge entail, Jimmy?" "It's going to be amazing," Jimmy explained, pulling out a stack of cards. "I'm going to give you different characters, scenarios, and styles, and you get to show off that incredible voice doing different interpretations. The audience gets to hear Morgan Freeman like they've never heard him before." Morgan smiled that knowing smile that had graced countless film posters. "All right, Jimmy, I'm game, but I should warn you, at my age, the voice isn't quite what it used to be." "Are you kidding me?" Jimmy protested. "Your voice is timeless." "Okay, first challenge. Morgan Freeman as a sports announcer calling a golf match." Morgan cleared his throat and leaned into his microphone. "And Tiger Woods approaches the 18th green," he began in his trademark cadence, knowing that this putt will determine not just the championship, but perhaps the very meaning of. Suddenly his voice cracked, not dramatically, but enough that everyone noticed. Morgan stopped mid-sentence, his hand instinctively going to his throat. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, and for the first time in the interview, his voice sounded uncertain. "Let me try that again." He cleared his throat and began again, but the same thing happened. A slight rasp, a barely perceptible tremor that wouldn't have been noticeable in normal conversation, but was impossible to ignore when coming from the voice everyone expected to be perfect. Jimmy's smile faltered slightly as he realized something was wrong. "Morgan, are you okay? We can skip this if you want." Morgan looked out at the expectant audience, then back at Jimmy. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way that was completely unprecedented for the man America considered the voice of authority itself. "This is my worst nightmare, Jimmy." The words hung in the air like a confession. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone tried to process hearing Morgan Freeman, the Morgan Freeman, sound anything less than completely confident. Jimmy glanced at his production team, then made a decision that would define this moment forever. He set down his cards and leaned forward, abandoning the game completely. "What do you mean?" Jimmy asked gently. Morgan was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of fear that was heartbreaking to hear. "Every morning when I wake up," Morgan said slowly, "the first thing I do is speak out loud, just to make sure it's still there, the voice, because I know that someday it won't be." The audience was completely transfixed. This wasn't the Morgan Freeman they knew from movies and documentaries. This was a man confronting his mortality through the lens of his greatest gift. "You see," Morgan continued, and his voice was getting stronger as he spoke, as if the act of confession was itself therapeutic. "People think Morgan Freeman is this voice. For 50 years, I've been defined by these vocal cords. God, narrator, wise mentor. It's all been about the voice." Jimmy stayed quiet, letting Morgan continue. "But what happens when it's gone?" Morgan asked, and there was something almost desperate in the question. "What happens when the voice that people have trusted to explain the universe starts to shake? When the voice of God starts to crack?" The pain in his admission was so raw that several audience members were visibly emotional. "I've spent my entire career being the voice of certainty," Morgan continued. "When people hear Morgan Freeman speak, they believe what they're hearing is truth. But lately, I lie awake at night terrified that I'm going to wake up one morning and that voice will be gone. And if the voice is gone, what's left of me?" Jimmy made a decision that transcended television. He stood up from behind his desk and walked around to sit in the chair beside Morgan. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was one human being trying to comfort another, facing the inevitable passage of time. "Morgan," Jimmy said with profound gentleness, "can I tell you something?" Morgan nodded, looking suddenly smaller than his legendary presence usually suggested. "Your voice is incredible. It's one of the most beautiful instruments in human history. But that's not why people love you." Morgan looked at Jimmy with surprise. "It's not?" "No," Jimmy said with absolute conviction. "People love you because of what you choose to do with that voice. You don't just speak words. You give them weight, meaning, comfort. You've used your gift to tell stories that matter, to bring wisdom to characters, to make people feel less alone in the universe." Tears were beginning to form in Morgan's eyes, and the sight was so unprecedented that it felt like witnessing something sacred. "But without the voice," Morgan began. "You're still the man who chooses those words," Jimmy interrupted gently. "You're still the storyteller, the actor, the human being who understands how to connect with people's hearts. The voice is the instrument, Morgan, but you're the musician." The audience began to react then, not with applause, which would have been wrong, but with small sounds of recognition and appreciation for witnessing such a vulnerable moment. "You know what I think?" Jimmy continued. "I think even if your voice changes, even if it becomes something different than what it is now, people will still listen because they're not just hearing Morgan Freeman's voice, they're hearing Morgan Freeman's soul. Morgan wiped his eyes with a handkerchief he pulled from his jacket pocket. You really believe that? I know it, Jimmy said, because right now, sitting here, being honest and vulnerable and human, this is the most powerful I've ever heard you sound, and it has nothing to do with perfection. A small smile began to creep across Morgan's face. You know, Jimmy, in all my years of giving voice to other people's words, I don't think I've ever been as honest as I'm being right now. And how does that feel? Jimmy asked. Morgan considered this for a moment. Terrifying, he said, and also liberating. It wasn't just late-night television. It was a reminder that our greatest gifts are not who we are, but what we choose to do with them. And sometimes the most beautiful thing we can do is admit that we're afraid of losing them and discover that we're so much more than we ever imagined.